In the cold, silent void of space, humanity had begun its journey beyond Earth, spreading out to distant planets with hope in their hearts. They were explorers, settlers, and dreamers, driven by the belief that they could carve a peaceful existence among the stars. But not all species shared that vision. Far from it. The Takari, a fierce, warlike race, had been watching humanity's growth, their minds filled with the scent of conquest. They were a race of enormous beings, their bodies covered in thick armored scales, and their eyes gleamed with an unyielding hunger for power. To them, the humans were yet another prey to subjugate, another species to bring under their cruel control. Captain Elena Ramirez stood at the helm of the Valor, a vessel entrusted with the delicate mission of establishing peaceful relations with the Takari. Earth's fleet had received intelligence suggesting that the Takari were open to negotiation. At least, that's what they had hoped. But as Elena's ship approached the remote planet, things quickly turned wrong. A sudden, unexpected burst of energy shot through the vast emptiness, sending her ship into a violent spiral. It didn't take long for Elena to realize that this wasn't some natural disaster. The Takari had set a trap. Within moments, the Valor was under attack, its shields buckling under heavy fire. Explosions rocked the ship, and alarms blared in every corner. Elena, calm in the chaos, barked orders to her crew, directing them to fight back with everything they had. The Takari fleet, overwhelming in number and strength, descended upon them like a swarm of locusts. Their massive ships surrounded the Valor, leaving no room for escape. It became a fight for survival, not just for the ship, but for the very lives of the humans on board. With a final, desperate push, Elena ordered her crew to abandon ship, knowing that their chances of survival aboard the Valor were slim. They scrambled into escape pods, ejecting from the ship as it was torn apart by the enemy's relentless bombardment. Elena, along with a small group of officers, made their way to a nearby planet's surface, their escape pods scattering across the alien world. As the pod's hatches opened, Elena stepped onto the unknown planet, the ground beneath her feet unfamiliar and cold. Her heart raced, but there was no time to waste. The Takari would be searching for survivors, and they wouldn't show mercy. In the distance, Elena could see the glow of Takari ships descending from the sky. Their warriors would not stop until they had hunted every last human down. But Elena, always the strategist, knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to turn the tables. As she led her crew to find shelter, she pondered their next move, knowing that any wrong step could lead to death. They needed to outthink the Takari, not just outfight them. But then, something unexpected happened. As they navigated the alien terrain, Elena's crew was ambushed once again, surrounded by a group of Takari soldiers. In the midst of the chaos, Elena found herself face to face with the towering figure of Vorzhek, the leader of the Takari forces. His form loomed above her, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the battlefield. His scales shimmered in the dim light, and his eyes glowed with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. This was the enemy, the one who would decide their fate. He could easily have killed her in that moment, but instead, he studied her with a look that seemed almost intrigued. Elena, bloodied but unbowed, stood tall before him. The Takari saw only the strength of her will, not the weakness they expected. It was a moment of confrontation that neither side had anticipated, and it would change everything. Elena knew this was only the beginning of a battle that would test, not just her strength, but the very heart of what it meant to be human. As the Takari leader's eyes never left hers, Elena felt the weight of the moment. This encounter would not be forgotten, not by her, nor by the alien warriors who stood before her. Something inside Elena stirred, a belief that the choice between life and death, mercy and violence, might hold the key to everything. Elena was bound, her wrists tight against the cold, unforgiving metal of the Takari ship. the weight of her situation pressing heavily on her chest. The Takari soldiers stood around her, their eyes filled with an unsettling mix of disdain and curiosity. They had her right where they wanted her. She had fought to survive, to protect her crew. But now, as she stared into the eyes of Dvorak, the towering Takari warlord, she felt the crushing weight of inevitability. They had captured her, and this time there was no escape. Her crew was watching from a distance, their fate now tied to hers. Elena knew that the Takari wouldn't show mercy, not to her or anyone under her command. A swift death awaited her. The only question was how. Dvorak's voice rumbled through the air, deep and commanding. "You have led your people to this point, human," he growled, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "You will either die like the weakling you are, or you will prove yourself strong and kill. Choose now." They threw a weapon at her feet, a blade of gleaming black metal. Elena's eyes locked onto the weapon. Her fingers twitched, longing for it. She knew she could grab it, fight her way out, but there was a cost to that action, a cost that went beyond her own life. If she killed one of them, she would be no better than the very creatures she had fought against. It was an instinct that pulled at her, that urged her to survive by any means necessary. But survival at the cost of her soul? Elena refused. The Takari wanted bloodshed, and they wanted her to become like them, merciless, unforgiving, and brutal. TUI. Soldiers around her jeered, thinking her hesitance was weakness. Dvorak's eyes gleamed, sensing the struggle within her. He leaned closer, his voice almost mocking. "You think your morals matter here? Do you think your death will be anything other than a footnote in the history of our conquest? Pick up the weapon. Kill or perish. Prove you are not a weakling." Elena's gaze hardened, her jaw clenched. The weapon remained on the ground before her, a symbol of all the choices that had led to this moment. Her crew's lives were in her hands, but she could not, would not betray who she was. If she picked up the blade, she would be no different than the enemy. Her thoughts flashed to the faces of her crew, of the people she had sworn to protect, and to the promise she made to herself long ago that she would never let the darkness consume her. With a deep breath, Elena made her choice. She stepped back, deliberately, slowly, and then to the shock of everyone watching, she dropped to her knees and let the weapon fall from her hand. Her gaze never wavered as it locked with Dvorak's. The Takari soldiers were silent, confused, as if waiting for her to speak, to explain this strange act of defiance. Elena's voice rang out, calm yet unwavering, as she looked directly into the warlord's eyes. "I would rather die than become like you," she said, her words cutting through the tense silence like a blade of their own. "Your ways are not mine. You may take my life, but I will not become a killer, not even to save myself." The moment hung in the air like a challenge thrown into the heart of the enemy. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Dvorak stood frozen, his piercing gaze fixed on her. His mind worked furiously, trying to understand this strange human in front of him. This human who, instead of cowering, was challenging him in the only way that truly mattered. He had expected fear. He had expected her to beg for mercy or to lash out with rage. But instead, she had done the impossible. She had refused to give in to the very nature that the Takari prized above all else. The silence stretched, and the Takari soldiers began to murmur among themselves. There was something unsettling about Elena's defiance. She had offered them no violence, no resistance in the way they understood it. And yet, in her refusal to kill, in her absolute rejection of their way, she had proven herself far more dangerous than any weapon they had ever encountered. Dvorak, for the first time, found himself unsure. Was this weakness? Or was this strength in a form he couldn't comprehend? In that moment, Elena had won, not through brute force but through the sheer power of her conviction. The Takari, who had long believed in their superiority, had just encountered something far more terrifying than their own brutality. The human spirit, unbroken, resolute, and unwilling to surrender its humanity. And that was something they could not fight with swords or guns. Word of Elena's defiance spread quickly through the ranks of the Takari, like wildfire consuming dry brush. The entire fleet buzzed with rumors about the human woman who had refused to kill, even when given the chance to save her life. To the Takari, who had spent centuries conquering worlds through brutal force, this was not just an act of weakness. It was an affront to everything they stood for. Death was their currency. The more you killed, the more you proved your strength. Weakness was never tolerated, and mercy was a concept alien to them. For a human to refuse to kill when survival was at stake was something they could not understand, and it rattled them in a way they couldn't quite articulate. Vorjek, the Takari warlord, ordered Elena and her crew to be imprisoned. He could not kill her, at least not yet. He needed to know what made her different, why she hadn't acted like all the other species they had crushed underfoot. Why had she chosen peace over violence? The question gnawed at him, clawing away at his certainty, his belief that their way was the only way. She had denied the primal urge for survival that every other species had given into. Her defiance unsettled him in a way that he couldn't explain. For the first time, Vorzek wondered if there was something more to this human. Something more dangerous than any weapon they had ever faced. Elena was thrown into a dark, cold holding cell with her crew. The walls were thick, and the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of metal and dust. But despite the grim surroundings, Elena's composure never wavered. Her calmness was like a stark contrast to the usual chaos and fear that overtook prisoners of war. Even in the face of certain death, she stood tall. Her crew, though shaken by the ambush and the loss of their ship, looked to her for strength, and she gave it to them. They followed her lead, though they too could feel the weight of the situation. The Takari had them in their grasp, and their chances of survival were slim. What was more unsettling to the Takari captors, though, was the silence that surrounded Elena and her crew. Most captives begged, cried, or struggled in the face of imprisonment. Some fought back, even if it was futile. But Elena did none of these things. She didn't scream for help, didn't try to bargain for her life. She simply waited, her posture serene, her mind clearly working. It disturbed the Takari warriors who guarded her. They watched her, puzzled by her calm demeanor, and it made them uneasy. They had expected her to be broken, to plead for mercy, to beg for her life. But she had done none of that, and that was something they couldn't shake off. Among the Takari warriors, whispers began to grow. Some of them began to question their own methods. How could one small human woman, with no strength to speak of, hold such an unyielding power? How could she choose peace in the face of death, where every other species they had encountered had chosen the path of violence? It was an idea that planted the seeds of doubt in their minds, slowly but steadily. Some of the younger warriors began to wonder if their way of life was truly the only way. Had they been wrong to conquer and destroy so indiscriminately? Were they truly superior, or was there something more to the human spirit than they had ever given credit for? Vorjek, though, was not so easily swayed. His pride and his experience told him that weakness would only lead to downfall. Yet, even as he tried to push the thoughts of Elena's actions aside, he couldn't fully rid himself of the unsettling feeling her behavior had caused. The longer he observed her, the more he realized that there was something deeper at play, something more than just physical strength. There was a kind of power in her resolve, a strength that wasn't forged in combat but in the mind and heart. Elena had chosen not to kill not out of weakness, but out of something far more dangerous. She had chosen mercy because she believed in something greater than survival. As Elena sat in her cell, her thoughts focused on the challenge ahead. The Takari would never let her go willingly, but there was a plan in motion. She didn't know how yet, but she would find a way to turn this situation around. It wouldn't be through violence or weapons. It would be through something far stronger. Her unwavering belief that humanity's refusal to give in to cruelty was the very thing that could defeat them. Unbeknownst to her, the Takari were already beginning to question their own ways. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and nothing, not even their pride, could stop them from growing. Days turned into weeks, and Elena's crew remained trapped. In the holding cell, their spirits not broken, but weighed down by the constant pressure from their captors. The Takari knew that physical strength alone wouldn't win this battle. They needed to break the humans' will. Elena had already shown her resistance to their violence, but now they would try a different tactic, one aimed directly at her mind. They used psychological warfare to wear her down, hoping that the isolation, the endless questioning, and the threats against her crew would eventually crack her resolve. Vorjek visited Elena again, his massive figure looming in the doorway of her cell. His eyes were cold, calculating as he stepped closer to her, watching for any sign of weakness. "You have shown us your strength, human," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "But strength is nothing without the will to survive. We will see how much longer your precious morals hold up when we begin to strip them away." Elena stood, tall, unwavering as always. She had heard threats like this before. She knew what they wanted, to make her lose control, to provoke her into rage. But she had faced far worse in her life, and she had learned that anger was a weapon that could destroy her more than any enemy could. So she stayed calm, her face a mask of determination. Vorjek wasn't done. He had another card to play, something he believed would finally break her. Without a word, he signaled to his soldiers, and they brought forward one of Elena's crew members, David, a young ensign who had been with her since the early days of her career. The soldiers shoved him to his knees in front of Elena. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was a certain trust in them, a silent plea for her to save him. Vorjek stepped forward, his towering presence casting a shadow over David's trembling form. "You want to protect your people?" Vorjek sneered. "Then prove it. Watch closely, human, as I decide whether this one lives or dies. His fate is in your hands." Elena's heart tightened as she stared at David, knowing the situation was grim. The Takari would not hesitate to execute him, but there was a choice she could make. They wanted her to feel the sting of helplessness, to be forced to choose between her crew and her morals. Vorjek's eyes gleamed, expecting her to beg, to plead for mercy. But Elena didn't flinch. Instead, her voice broke the heavy silence, calm and measured. "I will take his place. Release him. Kill me instead." There was a long pause, as Vorjek and his soldiers looked at her in confusion. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The absurdity of her offer hung in the air, defying all logic and reason. The Takari couldn't understand this. How could a human, someone so small, so fragile, choose to sacrifice herself in place of one life? Among so many, it made no sense to them. To the Takari, death was a tool, a weapon used to instill fear, and it was always used without hesitation. But this was different. Elena wasn't afraid of death. She wasn't afraid to give her life if it meant sparing her crew. She didn't see it as a loss. She saw it as an act of strength. Vorjek's expression hardened, and the soldiers behind him shifted uncomfortably. They had expected her to beg for mercy, to show desperation or anger. Instead, she had offered herself without hesitation, without fear, as if her life meant nothing compared to the lives of those she cared for. It was an act of selflessness that made no sense to them, and that was precisely what unsettled them. "Your offer is absurd," Vorjek finally said, his voice a low growl. "You would sacrifice yourself for one of them? For a weakling?" Elena's eyes met his, unwavering. "I would sacrifice myself for them, yes, because their lives mean more than mine. We don't need to kill to win. We need to stand together to show that there is another way. The words hung in the air, carrying with them a power that no weapon could match. The Takari soldiers, hardened and ruthless, looked between Elena and their leader. There was a shift in the air, a tension that none of them could ignore. Vorjek's eyes flickered with something he didn't understand. Unease, perhaps even fear. He had expected violence, rage, or submission. But this human had given him something far more terrifying, the refusal to become like him, the refusal to bend to his will, to let the violence consume her. For the first time, Vorjek didn't know what to do. Elena's actions had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, and he couldn't easily dismiss it. The more he tried to break her, the more he realized that there was something far more dangerous than violence. It was a human mind that could not be controlled, a human spirit that would not be bent. And that, to Vorjek, was the real terror, the fear of something beyond what he could conquer. As the days dragged on, Vorjek's obsession with Elena grew. He could not understand her. Her refusal to break, to stoop to their level, gnawed at him like a persistent wound. Every time he thought he had seen all there was to see of her, Elena would do something that unsettled him further. Her calmness in the face of death, her ability to remain unbroken, despite all the tactics he had employed, made him question everything he thought he knew about power and weakness. Elena was not a warrior in the way the Takari understood it. She didn't fight with blades or guns, but she wielded something far more powerful. Her belief in life, in mercy, in refusing to become a part of the violence that defined the Takari, was a force unlike anything Vorjek had ever encountered. The more he studied her, the more he realized that there was something deep inside her that he could not control. It was a strength that he couldn't break with force or intimidation. It wasn't physical power. It was something far more dangerous. Moral strength. Meanwhile, Elena's crew, although imprisoned and severely outnumbered, were not idle. In secret, they worked to repair their ship, making small adjustments and preparing for any opportunity that might arise. But Elena's influence extended beyond just her crew. As the days passed, she began to speak quietly with some of the Takari soldiers, those who seemed to linger on the edges of their brutal existence, who looked hesitant when their warlord gave orders or when the others spoke of their conquests. Elena spoke to them of peace, of the human desire to live, to find a better way, even when the odds were against them. Her words were simple, but they struck a chord with those who were starting to question the endless cycle of violence. It wasn't long before Elena's message began to spread, quietly at first, like a whisper in the shadows. The Takari soldiers who had been silently disillusioned with their way of life found themselves drawn to the humans' courage. They had grown tired of bloodshed, of always being at war, and some of them began to see the cracks in their leader's authority. It wasn't that they were afraid of Vorjek. They had come to fear something far more dangerous, the moral clarity that Elena brought with her. She was not afraid to face death, nor to challenge their deeply ingrained beliefs. Her refusal to kill, her belief in something greater than themselves, made them question their own violent ways. It was not a weakness, as they had believed, but a terrifying strength. Vorjek began to notice the change. His inner circle, which had once been unified in their loyalty to him, now seemed fractured. The tension was palpable in the warlords' quarters, where his most trusted commanders gathered. They whispered to each other, casting furtive glances at Elena as she remained calm in her cell, unaffected by their threats or their taunts. The soldiers who had once stood proudly by Vorjek's side now seemed uncertain. Some of them avoided his gaze. Others would not meet his orders with the same fervor they had before. It was clear that the seeds of doubt were beginning to sprout in places they had not expected. Vorjek, ever the strategist, understood that the strength of his army was not only in their ability to fight, but in their unity. If even a small part of his army began to question their mission, His entire conquest could unravel. But what disturbed him the most was that he could not root out the source of this division. Elena's example was so simple, so pure in its message, that it was impossible to destroy. The more he tried to force her to yield, the more he realized that her defiance was not just resistance, it was a symbol, a beacon for those within his ranks who were beginning to see the futility of endless war. In the nights, when the Takari soldiers thought no one could hear, the quiet murmurs began to grow. Some of the younger warriors spoke in hushed tones, discussing Elena's message of mercy, of the possibility of peace. It wasn't long before Elena's words reached the ears of those in power, and the cracks in the Takari's resolve began to deepen. The soldiers who once believed in the power of violence were now torn, struggling with the unsettling truth that there was another way to live. And it was this internal conflict, this uncertainty among the Takari, that slowly but surely began to unravel their brutal strength. Elena had planted a seed within them, and now, as more and more soldiers began to question the very foundation of their warlord's reign, Dvořák could feel the walls closing in on him. The heart of the Takari was no longer as solid as it once seemed. Something had shifted, and the more they tried to suppress it, the more they feared the power of the human spirit. Dvořák's frustration had reached a breaking point. The unrelenting calm of Elena, her refusal to bow to his will, had festered in his mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. He could not understand it. She had no fear of death, no desire to fight, and yet she had managed to disturb him more profoundly than any weapon ever could. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a riddle that grew more complex with every passing day. His power over her seemed to wane, and that was something Dvořák could not abide. The Takari thrived on dominance and control, and Elena's refusal to engage in their violent world undermined everything he stood for. He had to break her, to crush her spirit, or risk losing the respect of his own people. In a moment of cold resolve, Dvořák made a decision. He would challenge Elena to a duel. He would force her to fight, to show her weakness. There could be no more room for defiance. The message had to be clear to both his people and hers. The Takari were superior, and no human, no matter how defiant, could stand against their power. The duel would be a spectacle, and Elena's defeat would reaffirm the Takari's unchallenged dominance. Dvořák made the announcement, his voice echoing through the ship. "The human will face me in combat. Let her witness firsthand the power of the Takari. We will see if her stubbornness survives this challenge." The warriors gathered in a circle, their eyes fixed on Elena, their faces a mixture of curiosity and expectation. This was it, the final act that would break the human's resolve. When Elena was brought forward, she did not flinch. She stood, with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout her captivity, her eyes steady and unyielding. Dvořák was towering before her, his muscular frame a reminder of the physical strength that defined his people. Yet Elena did not move to defend herself. The tension in the air was thick, the spectators holding their breath, waiting for the clash of power, for the moment when violence would settle the matter once and for all. But Elena surprised everyone, including Dvořák, by refusing to take up the challenge. She remained still, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at the warlord. "I will not fight you," she said softly, yet with a strength that rippled through the tense silence. Her voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of defiance. Dvořák's eyes narrowed, disbelief flashing in his gaze. "You refuse?" he growled. "Do you not fear death, human? Do you think you can stand here and defy me with words alone?" "I do not fear death," Elena replied, her voice steady. "What I fear is becoming like you, enslaved by violence, by the need to dominate and destroy. You have built your empire on fear and bloodshed, but it is not true power. True power lies in the choice to live in peace, to rise above violence, even when it seems like the only option. The words struck Vorzek like a blow, and for the first time since he had met her, doubt flickered in his eyes. Elena wasn't like the other species they had conquered. She wasn't afraid of death, nor did she see it as a tool to control. She had something far more dangerous, a belief that life had meaning beyond the bloodshed that defined the Takari existence. He had never encountered anyone who could challenge him this way, who could make him question everything he had been taught. The crowd of Takari warriors shifted uncomfortably. Elena's words were not just a refusal to fight, they were an indictment of everything they stood for. Her refusal was not born of fear or weakness. It was a quiet but powerful condemnation of the violence that had fueled their conquest of countless worlds. As she stood there, unwavering in her conviction, something began to stir within the hearts of the Takari soldiers. They had followed Vorzek because they believed in the supremacy of their people, but Elena's message challenged that belief. Could there be another way? Could strength truly come from something other than violence? Vorzek hesitated. The crowd could sense the shift in the air. His once unchallenged authority seemed to falter. He looked at Elena, then at his warriors, whose gazes were now filled with uncertainty. For the first time, Vorzek was not sure what to do. The choice before him was more than just about life or death. It was about the future of his people. And in that moment, something inside him wavered. Elena's defiance had done something he could not have anticipated. It had planted the seeds of doubt in his mind and in the minds of those around him. The Takari were no longer certain that the path of violence was the only way to achieve power. The murmurs among the Takari warriors grew louder, and Vorzek's resolve began to crack. The fearsome warlord, who had once been the embodiment of unyielding strength, now found himself questioning everything he had built. Elena's refusal to fight had ignited something in the hearts of his soldiers, a quiet rebellion, a desire for change. And as Vorzek stood there, faced with the human who had defied him in a way no one ever had, he realized that true power might not lie in dominance at all. It might lie in the choice to stand for something greater. The turning point had come. The future of the Takari was no longer certain. The tension in the Takari stronghold had reached its peak. Vorzek, the ruthless leader of the Takari, had spent weeks battling with his own thoughts, questioning everything he had ever known. The proud warrior, who had built an empire on bloodshed and conquest, now found himself standing at the crossroads of change, unable to ignore the overwhelming truth that Elena, the human he had sought to break, had defeated him in ways he could never have imagined. It wasn't through weapons or bloodshed, but through the sheer strength of her refusal to kill. Elena's defiance had shaken the very foundation of the Takari way of life, and Vorzek could no longer deny the power of what she represented. He stood before his commanders, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. The air was thick with anticipation, the Takari warriors awaiting their leader's next move. For the first time in his life, Vorzek didn't know what to say. His soldiers, once eager to follow his every order, now looked at him with eyes full of uncertainty. The command structure was fracturing, not from external forces, but from the internal shift Elena had caused. She had shown them something they had never considered, the strength that comes from mercy, the courage it takes to choose peace over destruction. And now, as Vorzek stood in front of them, he realized that the path they had been walking for centuries had no future. It was a path of ruin. The realization hit him with the force of a thunderclap. Elena had defeated him not with a sword, but with the quiet, unwavering power of a single human spirit. She had exposed the flaw in the Takari mindset. Violence, death, and conquest were not the answer. They led only to emptiness, to endless war, and to the eventual destruction of everything the Takari had worked to build. He had watched her, for weeks, waiting for her to break, but instead of bending to his will, she had planted the seed of doubt in his heart and in the hearts of his people. That seed had now grown into something undeniable, a truth that could no longer be ignored. Vorjek looked at his soldiers, his once loyal warriors, who now stood with their heads lowered, uncomfortable under the weight of what they had seen. The power of Elena's refusal to fight had shaken them to their core. And now, in the quiet of that realization, Vorjek did something he had never done before. He stepped away from the conflict. It wasn't a victory earned through force, but through the quiet surrender of his own pride. The Takari, for the first time in their history, had to consider another way. In the days that followed, Elena and her crew were released. The Takari did not do so out of fear of humanity's military strength or a show of dominance. Rather, they had come to a stark and humbling conclusion. They understood that humanity's strength did not lie in their ability to destroy, but in their capacity to preserve life, to choose mercy even in the face of overwhelming odds. It was this strength, this ability to refuse to become the very thing they feared, that had changed everything. The Takari, who had lived their lives by the blade, began to understand that their relentless pursuit of conquest had led them to the brink of extinction. The realization that they had been blinded by their own violent ways was undeniable. And so, the unthinkable happened. The Takari, once intent on exterminating humanity, chose to negotiate a truce. They reached out to the humans, not as conquerors, but as equals, acknowledging that the path of destruction they had chosen had only led them to misery. Elena's decision, to refuse violence and choose peace, had terrified them more than any weapon ever could. It was a terror rooted not in the fear of death, but in the fear of what they might become if they continued down their current path. The Takari warlord, once so confident in his power, now stood humbled. Elena had shown him that true strength was not about domination or fear. It was about the ability to rise above the cycle of violence, to choose life and peace even when the world seemed to demand war. Her simple act of refusal had defeated the Takari's entire philosophy, and in doing so, had saved countless lives. The truth had been exposed, and the Takari had no choice but to face it. Humanity's power lay not in its weapons, but in its spirit. Elena's victory was one that no force in the universe could ever overcome, because it was a victory of the human heart, a victory of peace over violence, of life over death.